What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Perhaps. If you're listening to this podcast, that means you were left behind. Jesus didn't come and grab you and take you up into the sky for the rapture this time around. But don't worry, there'll always be another rapture. This thing happens all the time. And what's funny is I actually didn't pay that much attention as the new rapture predictions started to gain a lot of traction and get a lot of viral in TikTok and other places, and a bunch of news stories about how these young people are talking about the rapture on Rapture Talk. And I didn't pay attention because I thought, oh, just another one. And I realized, I think this is a sign that I'm getting old. I'm 32. And what's funny is I've thought this a few times over the last couple of years as I've started to relate differently with people that are younger than me. When I was young, we think of that old person mindset, that boomer mindset, being very narrow-minded and closed-minded, not considering new perspectives. And it always just felt like they were just haters. And they just didn't want to listen to anybody. Now I'm starting to have a bit of empathy for boomers because I'm realizing some of that narrow-mindedness actually comes from them recognizing that they've seen this stuff before. I've seen it before. This stuff comes and goes. These new artists, I've seen this kind of artist come and go. I've seen this kind of movie come and go. I've seen this kind of politician come and go. I've seen a rapture prediction again and again and again. So don't tell me anything, Zoomer. Don't tell me anything, young whippersnapper. You don't know. You ain't been here. You just got here. It's like that James Franco meme with the noose around his neck. First time? This is your first rapture? Oh, ain't that cute. Definitely not my first time. And of course, I don't ever want to be like that. I don't ever want to be that much of an ass. But I have some empathy for that perspective now. I get it. And that's how I felt about this rapture. I was just like, yeah, we've seen this before. I've seen this. People get all excited for a new rapture date prediction, and it comes and people get all excited, and then it goes, and some people are all sad and other people are making fun of them, and we keep going on to the next one. But what was different about this one, some of you may not even know. Some of you this went like way out of your radar, but there was this South African pastor who claimed that Jesus came to him in a dream in 2018 and showed him the future and told him that he was going to come back and the rapture was going to happen in September 23rd, 2025 during the Jewish Feast of Trumpets. And he was so sure. He was on a podcast talking about it. And they're like, so you're 100% sure? And he's like, it's not even that. I'm 1 billion% sure. And for some reason, this caught on. And a bunch of young people, I mean, it wasn't just young people, it was older people too. But a bunch of people on TikTok, for some reason, fully bought into it. But then you started to see something that we haven't seen in recent years, which was people believing it so much that they were selling their houses, selling their cars. I mean, this kind of stuff has happened before. People selling their stuff. Back in the 1800s, there was a whole thing. People selling all their stuff and meeting together and waiting for the rapture to happen, and it didn't happen. But I guess what's different about this time is just all the content, viral content around it. I think that's what really makes this one unique. But yeah, people were selling their houses, selling their cars, quitting their jobs, getting rid of their clothes because they were convinced the rapture was going to happen. And there are even some TikTokers that were doing rapture trip tips, like talking about make sure when Jesus comes, you're going to be taken up into the sky. So make sure don't grab onto anything. Okay? It's just going to be a mess. And make sure you don't look down. You don't want to be like Lot's wife. Don't look down. You might get plopped back down to the ground. Or also saying, make sure you stay outside all day, rapture day, because you don't want to get stuck under the ceiling. And I know some people were definitely being satirical, but others weren't. They're dead serious. And what's weird is this stuff, like I grew up with a lot of end times talk, a lot of rapture talk. I grew up watching the Left Behind movies, reading the Left Behind books. I was a little kid. I read all 12 of the Left Behind adult book series and a few of the kids' versions too. And they just disappeared in those movies and books. This is new to me. This version of the rapture theory that says people are going to literally float up into the sky, going up into the stratosphere, up into space, and just keep going up until they get to heaven, I guess. And make sure you're outside because you don't want to get stuck under the ceiling. This is all new. This is all so new. And so I actually didn't catch up on this rapture talk until like today and yesterday, after the rapture didn't already happen. And I realized, oh yeah, more people are talking about this than usual. It was interesting. And sorry I couldn't make it last week for a podcast episode. I was feeling really overwhelmed and I got sick. And so I got real sick. It was a really bad stomach bug, but a lot of people are getting that right now. And yeah, when it came time for the podcast, I was just overwhelmed with life stuff, but also just everything happening right now after the murder of Charlie Kirk and a bunch of rhetoric being ramped up against leftists and trans people and immigrants, and a lot of people just falling for propaganda that says that if you're anti-fascist, you're a terrorist, basically. And it's just really discouraging to see a lot of people who don't dig deep into these narratives just buying into all of it. And seeing everything going on in the world right now, I understand the need for escapism. I get that. I feel that need all the time of just wanting to escape. And I think that's really at the core of a lot of this rapture stuff. People desperately wanting to escape. And that's been the core since the beginning, which isn't back in Bible times, by the way, but back in the 1800s. That's when people first started talking about the rapture, which was just a new interpretation of a couple of scriptures. John Nelson Darby was the dude who first started preaching about the rapture. And what's funny is, like I said, this one is unique because a lot more people are talking about it than usual. Because even it's like the last few years this has happened. I've seen little things of like rapture predictions came and went. But what was funny is I was watching some YouTube videos, and like comedy YouTubers who never ever talk about religion did some videos reacting to the rapture TikToks and people talking about the rapture. And some of these comedy YouTubers saying the name John Nelson Darby and words like dispensationalism, which is an interpretation of the Bible that says that we have ages one after the other, and that the Bible predicts things happening in future ages. And what's funny is these words and names like John Nelson Darby, I'm so used to hearing in very small circles, like theology nerds. or especially people who are really into talking about deconstructing harmful theologies. And by doing that, they go into the history and talk about, oh yeah, we could point to the points in history where people started talking this way about Christianity, and Christian fundamentalism isn't ancient at all. You could actually point to the source of all their talking points within the last 200 years. A lot of them just the last 100 years. And the thing is, they try to say, no, this is what the first Christians believed. Nah. And so the rapture is one of those things. And so you'd be in these conversations and they're like, okay, yeah, let's break this down. John Nelson Darby. And just hearing that name from these comedy YouTubers who never talk about religion was just so surreal. And even on TikTok, I was seeing kids on TikTok saying the name John Nelson Darby, like trying to educate each other. And it was a trip. But I think this is also, it makes me think, this is another sign of getting old. People forget. People need to hear these things. Even people who are into this stuff. And I think that's one of the things that's been hard for me over the last few years, is figuring out like what I want to do with my work in writing and speaking, and trying to stretch people's imagination around spiritual and political ideas and give a more liberative and healthy take on Christianity and Christian theology and the Bible. And what's hard about that is I forget a lot of what isn't actually common knowledge. Like when you become a real nerd about this stuff and you go deep and hear and read certain things again and again and again and again, you can forget, oh yeah, a lot of people still need to hear this. And that's just a generational thing. I'm realizing more and more that people forget. And so they need to hear it again and again and again and again. And I've even seen a gradual decline in these deconstruction creators, writers, Instagrammers, YouTubers, bloggers, who used to make a lot of content about deconstructing harmful theologies and conservative interpretations of the Bible and breaking down how, oh, actually they're really modern, and you could look at the history and see points where things switched. And I've seen a decline. I think part of it is people were just making that type of content because they were going through their own personal deconstruction, and that was the way that helped them work through it. And then they got through it and got over it and decided to do something else. But I think what's also happened is a lot of people start to think that this stuff is common knowledge, breaking down that actually the rapture isn't in the Bible and it's a pretty new thing. And so it's like this kind of, I'm combining two takes at once here. One, realizing how funny it is that a lot of people outside of these circles are having these conversations about the rapture. But then the other take is realizing even people within these circles who care about this stuff and want to learn more about it, not as many of them realize not as many of them know what you think they know. Such as the rapture is actually a new thing. And before I even started this podcast, before I heard about this rapture, the new rapture thing prediction, I would think I wouldn't want to talk about the rapture. We all know that that's fake. The Christians know by now, right? That was just a bunch of BS. But no. People need to hear it again and again and again and again. People forget. Also, people just stop talking about certain things, and therefore young people haven't heard it yet. And so I wanted to make sure I mentioned that in this episode for anyone out there listening to this that also wrestle with this feeling of like, well, what do I have to say? I know certain things, but everybody knows that. So what do I have to write about? What do I have to make a video about? What do I have to say to the world? What do I have to teach people? And it's actually a lot more than you realize. And I think when you actually start to practice that and write about things and speak about things that you think everybody already knows, you start to realize like, oh, wait, no, there's a bunch of people that are curious about this and want to learn more. And it turns out the rapture and end time stuff is still one of them. And I was actually thinking about making an end times video a few weeks ago. I just didn't get around to it. It's been a weird period in my life, but I still want to make this video, but just breaking down some of the ways that people talk about the Antichrist and the coming of the Antichrist and the conspiracy theories that would get wrapped up into it, the mark of the beast being a microchip and the surveillance state being used to persecute Christians. And like, that's the type of stuff I would hear when I was a kid, and just breaking that down and talking about the modern day surveillance state and yeah, just making a video about that. But I still want to do that, and hopefully I still can. But I wanted to talk a bit about the rapture in this episode, since people are talking about it and since we all got left behind. And when I was a kid, I really was scared of being left behind. I really thought it was a thing. I have this story, and I've met plenty of other people who have this story of being a kid, scared that the rapture would happen and their parents would be taken away and they'd be left behind because they were too sinful. And there was this constant fear, because it wasn't a teaching of, if you're a Christian, you'll be taken, you're fine. No, it's like, you have to be a good Christian, a loyal Christian, and a bunch of people in the church will be left behind. And so there's this constant fear of like, oh, well, what if I accidentally lie to my parents or say a cuss word or have a lustful thought and don't confess to Jesus my sin and repent in time before the rapture happens, then I'll get left behind. Or if I just randomly die, then I'll go to hell. And so I remember one time seeing my parents' clothes on the bed, and for a moment wondering if I got left behind. And I think there was other moments too. It was like when I didn't know where my parents were in the house and wondering if I got left behind. And I've heard that from plenty of other people when they're a kid. Some people like real dramatically looking for their parents and weeping, and then finding their parents and telling them, I thought you got raptured and I was left behind. It's traumatizing. And what's weird is it became so popular that people really thought that this is what the whole Christian faith was about. That this is what Jesus was talking about. But no. First of all, let's get a little deeper here. And as we get deeper and looking at the Bible, this will also be a bit controversial. But the Gospels, when Jesus talked about these apocalyptic visions, really, like, there's this passage in Matthew where it talks about the day where one will be taken, the other one will be left behind. But he's talking about a type of suffering that his people, the Jewish people of the time in the first century, would experience in the year 70 during the fall of Jerusalem, when there was a Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire, and Rome came and completely crushed them and destroyed the temple and destroyed Jerusalem. So that happens in the year 70. Jesus is teaching in the early 30s. But the Gospels aren't written until after the year 70, starting with Mark, then Matthew and Luke, and then John much later. And so here's why I say it could get controversial, because the traditional interpretation is that Jesus is predicting the future. Even if he was just talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in the year 70, he was still predicting from the early 30s to what would happen in the year 70, decades later. But another take is to realize that the writers are putting that perspective onto the lips of Jesus and combining these two narratives, knowing that the people who read these stories of Jesus would be wondering if Jesus's movement is pointless after the destruction of Jerusalem. And so they're writing as a way of saying, like, no, Jesus saw this coming, and the story still goes on. The movement still goes on. We're still doing that. We're still following what Jesus called us to do, starting these radical alternative communities where we share property, we take care of one another, and we proclaim that Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. And so, and I mean, also to be a bit charitable, Jesus may, and other Jewish prophets of the time, may have saw the destruction of the temple coming. And you see that also in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew prophets talking about destruction that was coming. But there was constant destruction and constant suppression under empire after empire, and specifically under the Roman Empire during Jesus. And so, yeah, sure, I'm open. I'm open for the interpretation that Jesus really did predict that. I'm open. That's fine. But I think the real thing we should all agree on is that he was talking about that in the year 70. Now, Revelation, that's another thing that people will point to, that say the whole book of Revelation was talking about what's going to happen in America 2,000 years later. Nah, not at all. Revelation, written a few decades after 70, and witnessing the persecution of Christians under the Roman Empire, specifically under Nero and then Domitian. So the Roman Emperor Domitian, written by John of Patmos, sent to this island, imprisoned, and he has this vision of Jesus ultimately destroying the empire so that everyone can be free, specifically Christians, be free. And so he's witnessing the persecution of Christians happening right in his lifetime. And the first readers would have witnessed it in their lifetime, happening around them under the Roman Empire. And part of that persecution was also because, like I said, they said Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. Talking about an ushering in of the kingdom of God, which implies an ushering out of the kingdom of Caesar. Even calling Jesus the Son of God, that was a political title given to Caesar before the Christians started using it for Jesus. There was a saying, and the thing was printed on some coins, or at least some buildings, that said, "There's no other name under heaven by which one can be saved than that of Caesar." And then in the book of Acts, Peter preaches, "There's no other name under heaven by which one can be saved than that of Jesus." The gospel comes from the word in Greek euangelion, which was initially a Roman imperial term that described Roman soldiers going town to town to tell of Caesar's latest military conquest. That was called a euangelion, or like a message or piece of news, good news. And the gospel writers start by saying, this is the euangelion of Jesus, who's actually the Son of God. Like, this was a radical anti-empire movement from the beginning. And so anyone who threatened the power of Rome was persecuted, crucified, beheaded, sent into prison, like John of Patmos. And so within that context, John is witnessing more and more persecution Roman emperors becoming more and more violent. And so they were talking about something they witnessed in their time with a radical hope, and you could even say genuine religious vision, that this empire will fall and God will defeat them in the end, and the oppressed will be free. That's what Revelation is about. There is still a way to claim the book of Revelation as prophetic when you stop seeing prophecy as a singular, narrow prediction of a singular future event, and instead see prophecy as something that's cyclical. Something, it's true because not because it's going to happen on this day, September 23rd, but rather it's true because it happens again and again and again and again and again. There's always empires, and they always fall. The empire rises and the empire will fall. And that's what Revelation is about. And so you get to, as Christianity becomes the religion of the empire in the 300s, and it continues to spread, and European Christianity European leaders use Christianity to justify colonization and eliminate their enemies and enslave and genocide people, claiming that this is what God has destined them to do. As they do that, they start to reinterpret some of the whole Bible, but some of these verses about God defeating the empires slowly evolves to like, oh yeah, God is helping us defeat the people in our way, those who are trying to stand against the empires. All that gets reinterpreted over time. And then when you get to John Nelson Darby in the early 1800s talking about a rapture and talking about these different ages, he didn't actually get much traction. And it wasn't until decades later that people started preaching this idea that the end is, all this stuff in Revelation was talking about a future age, and this age will happen beginning with Jesus coming back and taking us away, taking the Christians away. And then all this terrible thing will happen in the end of the world, the end of, and then there will be peace in paradise. And that didn't really start gaining traction until after the Civil War. And Andre Henry wrote a really good article about this in Religion News Service. And it was after the Civil War, looking at the changing world, the abolition of chattel slavery, and racist preachers loving preaching about the rapture, saying, don't worry, white Christians, I know it looks like the end of the world right now, but Jesus is going to save us from this. And they bought into it because they couldn't embrace a changing world. And then you get to the 20th century, 1900s, and it starts to gain more and more traction as you see the rise of different social movements fighting for civil rights and human rights, activist movements, and preachers were discouraging Christians from joining activist movements that a lot of other Christians were already a part of. More left-leaning Christians were part of, and even starting some of these activist movements. You have like the Catholic Worker, the Civil Rights Movement, a bunch of Christians involved in that, a bunch of Christians fighting for a New Deal and a bigger social safety net in the early 1900s. And Christians, like you had these Christians who saw that, of course, our faith would lead us to fight for a better world, free from capitalism, free from imperialism, free from racism, free from sexism. Of course, it just made sense. And I think that is how faith organically works, unless somebody comes in and manipulates you and tries to put a stop to your growing faith that connects you to participating in making this world a more just place. And then you have these preachers saying, who are very conservative and reactionary, saying, no, don't participate in those activist movements because the world is actually supposed to get worse. And that's when the rapture happens. And so the people who witnessed these changes just clung on to that idea. Oh, this isn't a sign of God moving in the world and leading these positive changes for human rights. This is actually the devil and the world getting worse, and the good white Christians are going to be saved by Jesus, and he's going to take us away in the rapture. And then you get to the late 20th century, which is when I came along in 1993 and the early 2000s, when people were talking a lot about the end times. And it gets attached to Christian Zionism, saying that war has to get worse and worse in Israel, or that whole area of the Middle East, or against Israel. And when war is at its peak against Israel, then Jesus is going to come back and save the day. And so it gets all wrapped up into that. And I think there's a lot of people over time who weren't Christian preachers, but were businessmen and politicians who took advantage of people wanting to cling to these ideas of escapism and the rapture and end times, and used it to their advantage to gain support for Republicans, to gain support for Israel, to gain support for big oil, discouraging environmentalism, discouraging any policy changes and regulations on companies. And I'm reminded right now, too, I remember reading a book where a guy was talking about a Christian perspective of caring for the earth, and talking about how a lot of Christian preachers have got this wrong when they've completely neglected care for the earth. And he said he was a pastor, and he moved to this new church, or he was the new pastor at this old church, and there is one of their buildings was falling apart, and they went in and investigated and realized that it was built on a terrible foundation, and a bunch of different parts of the building and the foundation were totally not up to code and were really dangerous. And he asked one of the older people that had been there for decades and decades, like, why would they build it like this? And he said, oh yeah, I remember when they built this church. And when they built that part of the building, they were convinced that Jesus was going to come back in just like a couple years. So they thought it didn't matter. And it just blows my mind of just such a radically different faith. And it's escapism. And I think there's these different kinds of escapism. There's the escapism of the oppressed who are tired of being oppressed and want Jesus to save them. And there's the escapism of the more privileged and the oppressors, and the oppressors use this escapism for the privileged, of this idea that the changing world of people fighting for human rights and more equality, and therefore you being less privileged, don't you want to get out of here? Don't you want an escape from that? People who can't handle a world that's better for everyone. People who want to cling on to their privilege. That's another kind of escapism that I think we still see at the core of rapture theology. And what's interesting, I also always think about Peter Rollins, this theologian, philosopher guy, wrote a different version of the idea of the rapture in this tract. I wonder, yeah, if this is still a thing. Some of you may not know, but they used to hand out these tracts of, like, how do you explain it? To evangelize to people, to get them to convert to Christianity. And you'd open it up, and a lot of them would have like comic strips, a little story. There was this guy named Jack Chick who used to write a lot of these, and it was a little story to get you to consider converting to Christianity. And people would just hand out these tracts. Sometimes they would just be like a mini essay in them, and they would hand them out trying to convert people. And Peter Rollins wrote his own version of one. It was this little comic strip. You can look it up on YouTube. He did a video version of it showing the illustrations. Just Peter Rollins, The Rapture. You can look that up. But what's really cool about this version is it shows it's the tribulation. People are seeing the suffering of the world and praying to God to save them. And then comes time for the rapture. And God in heaven says, it's time. It's time to separate my people from the rest of them, separate the sheep and the goats. And so he calls out all the people who seek to escape this suffering world. Call out to me, Lord, Lord, and I will take you away from it. So people calling out, Lord, Lord, and then it shows all these people floating up into heaven. And then they're in heaven and they're all happy and excited, and they're like, oh, I'm so happy we escaped. But God sure took his time, didn't he? And they laugh and like, they're just happy to be there. And then God says, now it's time. Now it's time for me to make my home on the earth, to be with my people who embraced the suffering of the world, who gave up heaven for the earth. The people who refuse to escape the suffering of their fellow humans. And God leaves them behind in heaven by themselves without God, and makes God's home on the earth with everyone else. And it's this twist to just make you rethink that escapist theology. And what's also interesting about like the whole thing, the whole rapture stuff, is like if you look deep into what Revelation actually says and try to paint it as a picture of what'll happen in the future, Revelation describes the whole thing ending with a new earth. There's nothing there about escaping to some other heavenly realm. It's all about the earth and everyone who's ever died at the same time resurrecting on the earth. And God makes a new earth on the earth. But I don't interpret it as like this prediction of the future. But if we did, it still doesn't make sense, the rapture and all that. And so, yeah, it's interesting to think about this escapism, why so many people want to escape. And what I would like to see is a faith that embraces the world and embraces humanity, just like Jesus embraced the world, embraced humanity through the incarnation, and realize that our faith should be something that calls us toward one another, to take care of one another, to build a better world here and now, not to just transcend and escape and ignore other people because we gotta just focus on God. We just gotta focus on the future. We just gotta focus on getting into heaven. Nah, I think that's a very messed up twisting of faith. And we'll see what happens. And I think there's been a lot of times where I've felt like it was really important to me to give this other perspective. And over time, I think it became less important to me to like do the whole deconstruction thing, breaking down the Bible and what the Bible actually says, and the starting point for different interpretations, different theologies. And now I got a little bit of revitalized passion for it. Like, oh yeah, I guess people still do need to talk about this stuff. So yeah, I'm still here. We're still talking about it. We'll see what happens. But it's also funny because this stuff is kind of off my radar. I don't have any friends that talk about the end times or the rapture. Like, in some ways, it just feels like a very past life thing. Because I left evangelicalism in 2017. And I didn't keep any of those friends. I got cut off from a lot of that community. And that's that. And I still have a lot of Christian friends. But the Christian friends are the type of Christians who know that stuff is ridiculous. And recognize that rapture stuff and the end time stuff is a very modern interpretation and twisting of scriptures. And that's that. And there's times where I could start to think like, oh yeah, people don't think like this anymore. I mean, you hear that all the time from atheists who just have a bunch of atheist friends. Like, people aren't religious anymore. That's like a thing of the past. That's such a thing of the past. No, it's just your circle. Conservative Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity is still very much a thing. And it's growing. All those churches are growing. But I think there's going to be a lot of people looking for an alternative, looking for another way of expressing their faith. And again, any of y'all out there who are listening to this who like writing, communicating, speaking, teaching about this different alternative faith, you probably have a lot more to teach people than you realize. I think we're going to keep seeing a lot more people leaving these fundamentalist Christian spaces and looking for a different perspective. I bet you there are a lot of young people that were woken up by this recent rapture prediction fiasco. So we'll see what happens. And that's that. That's today's episode. We'll be here next week, I promise. No rapture. No rapture. We'll be here. See you later. Bye-bye.